On a rain-slick Friday in late 1982, the neon outside Rose City ink bled pink across the puddles like a wound that refused to close. And inside the shop, the air held that familiar mix of disinfectant, tobacco, and iron, the faint metallic tang that always followed the first wipe of skin. Ray Calder had been on his feet since noon, wiping down trays, replacing needles, pretending he didn't hear the same 3 stories Portland men told when they wanted pain to mean something. By 7, the street had gone soft with drizzle and Christmas lights, and the shop should have been done for the night. That's when the bell above the door chimed once, clean, controlled, and a man stepped in as if he'd timed his entrance to a second hand no one else could see. He wasn't the usual kind of customer. No swagger, no half-drunk bravado, nobody clapping him on the back. Mid-30s, maybe? Broad through the shoulders, hair cut short but not military short, a coat too plain to remember, and shoes too clean for a wet night. He carried a thin manila envelope tucked under his arm, like paperwork. Not a design. Paperwork. Still taking walk-ins? He asked. Voice level. Polite in a way that didn't invite conversation. Ray glanced at the clock, then at the man's hands. The nails were trimmed. The knuckles were unscarred. The palms had that faint smoothness of someone who didn't work with tools but knew how to hold them anyway. Ray nodded toward the chair. Depends what you want. The man laid the envelope on the counter and slid it forward. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No magazine cutout. No childish sketch. No girlfriend's doodle. It was a precise line drawing done in black ink. A crest that looked like something a family might invent to feel old world. Except it was too balanced, too measured, too engineered. A shield, a pair of wings, a small banner, ornamental flourishes that repeated with the kind of consistency you saw in drafting tables. Not in sentiment. My wife, the man said, and the phrase landed flat, like a label applied because it was expected. She wants a family design, something that looks traditional. Ray had heard from my wife 1,000 times. Usually it came with a smile, a shrug, some story about anniversaries and forgiveness. This man said it like he was reading a line off a form. Ray studied the border, an innocent braid of tiny marks running around the crest like embroidery. Except the braid wasn't a braid. It was a sequence. Short notch, long notch, space, short, short, long, space. Then a little twist that looked decorative until you noticed it returned at exact intervals. Not where the eye wanted it, but where a system would put it. Where'd you get this drawn up? Ray asked. Casual, like it didn't matter. A friend? The man replied without looking away. His eyes stayed on Ray's face. Not the paper. Watching reaction. Not art. Ray felt the first little pinch of unease, the kind that had nothing to do with danger yet, and everything to do with someone entering your life carrying rules you didn't know existed. He reached for a pencil and traced the border lightly, counting without meaning to. The marks repeated in groups that didn't feel aesthetic. They felt functional. What part do you want? Ray said. And where? The man didn't hesitate. Left shoulder blade. Centered. And the border stays exactly as drawn. Every notch. Every gap. Outside. A car passed slow enough that its tires hissed through the puddles like a whisper being dragged along the curb. Ray told himself it was nothing. Just a wet night. Just a careful customer. Just another story someone wanted to wear. But as he lifted the stencil paper and the man rolled his shoulder out of his coat with practiced ease, Ray realized something that made his throat go dry. This wasn't a man bringing in a tattoo. This was a man bringing in instructions. Ray prepped the station the way he always did, methodical, almost bored on purpose because nothing spooked a client faster than seeing the artist take them too seriously. He washed his hands, snapped on gloves, laid out the inks, and set the needle grouping like he was setting a table. The man, he'd said his name was Daniel Price, and the name sounded like it had been chosen for how easily it disappeared, sat on the chair with his back exposed, shoulders square, breathing shallow enough that Ray could feel the control in it. Any allergies? Ray asked. No. First tattoo. Yes. The yes came too clean. No laugh. No nerves. No little confession. Just compliance. Ray pressed the stencil to Daniel's shoulder blade and peeled it away. The crest transferred perfectly. Sharp lines. Symmetrical wings. That border of notches and gaps circling the whole thing like a fence. Daniel craned his neck to look at it in the mirror. But his eyes didn't go to the shield or the wings. They went straight to the border, tracing it like a man checking a lock. "Looks good," Daniel said. "Just don't improvise." Ray gave him the easy half-grin clients expected. "I'm not Picasso." He started with the outline. Slow, deliberate passes, letting the machine's buzz fill the silence. The shop's radio played low near the counter, an AM station bleeding through weather reports, and a late-night preacher. Daniel didn't flinch at the first bite of the needle. He didn't clench his hands. He didn't ask how long. The only thing that changed was his breathing whenever Ray's needle approached the border. The moment the tip hovered near those notches, Daniel's lungs would tighten, then release when Ray moved away, like the border mattered more than the skin around it. Halfway through, Ray paused to wipe ink and blood with a paper towel. Under the fresh lines, the border pattern emerged cleaner than it had on paper. Notches arranged in sequences that didn't look decorative once they sat in a circle. They looked like timing. Ray had grown up around longshoremen and old Navy uncles who played with radios on weekends. Men who thought Morse code was a party trick. He didn't know the alphabet by heart, but he knew what it felt like when a pattern wasn't random. "Your wife into nautical stuff?" Ray asked lightly, as if the question came from the wing design. Daniel's answer came too fast. "It's not nautical." "Not, she's not." "Not, I don't know." "Just, it's not." Correcting a classification, Ray nodded and kept working, letting the machine talk so he didn't have to. But the longer he stared at the border, the more his mind did what minds do when they're trying to protect you. It started matching shapes to meaning. The gaps weren't placed for balance. They were placed like separators. The double notches weren't flourishes. They were signals. Behind Daniel's coat on the chair, the manila envelope sat open a crack. Ray could see more paper inside. Thin sheets. Clean. The corner of a graph line. Not art. Not from a friend's sketchbook. A bell chimed again at the door, and Ray's heart gave a stupid little jump. A couple walked in young, laughing, dripping rain, asking about a flash design. Normal people. Real noise. Ray felt his body loosen a fraction, then tense again when he saw Daniel's head tilt just slightly, as if tracking the couple's footsteps without turning to look. Daniel stayed perfectly still, but his voice dropped, almost to himself. "Do you get a lot of government types in here?" Ray kept his tone casual. "Depends on the day." Daniel didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. The question itself was the test, whether Ray would brag, whether he'd name names, whether the shop was a listening post or just a place that sold pain. Ray's needle moved back to the border, and he watched Daniel's shoulder muscle tighten under the skin like a warning. That's when Ray understood the simplest, most frightening thing about the night. Whatever this circle of notches meant, it wasn't meant for Ray to read. It was meant for someone else to recognize at a glance on a stranger's back. In a crowd, Ray finished the last curve on the wing, wiped, leaned back, and let his eyes go soft like he was just checking symmetry. But his attention stayed locked on the door and on Daniel's breathing. On the way that man's body treated the border like a live wire. "I'm going to swap needles for the shading." Ray said, 2 minutes. Daniel nodded without looking up. "Make it quick." Ray stood, walked to the back counter where the autoclave clicked and hissed, and pretended to fuss with caps of ink. His hands did the motions on autopilot while his head ran a separate track. The border sequences, the clean insistence on don't improvise, the envelope with technical paper, the question about government types. None of it was enough by itself. Together it formed a shape he didn't want. He glanced at the shop phone mounted near the sink. He could call the cops and say, "What a guy asked me not to improvise on his tattoo." He could call nobody and pretend this was normal. Let the man pay. Leave. And whatever happened afterward wouldn't be his business. That was the easiest path. It was also the one that felt like stepping over a body in a hallway because you didn't want to get involved. Ray dried his hands, turned, and caught Daniel watching him in the mirror, watching the back room. The phone, the door reflection behind Ray's shoulder. Daniel's eyes didn't look like a first-timer's eyes. They looked like someone measuring exits. The bell chimed again. This time it wasn't laughing kids. A man came in alone, raincoat dripping onto the mat, hair combed too flat for the weather, carrying nothing but a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. He didn't look at the flash on the walls. He didn't browse. He stood just inside the threshold, letting the cold air roll in behind him, and his gaze went straight to Daniel's back like it had a magnet in it. Then the man glanced to Ray and smiled. Small, controlled, as if the smile was for any witness who might later remember. He didn't look threatening. Evening, the man said. His voice was mild. You take walk-ins? Ray forced himself to nod. Depends what you need. The man's eyes dipped again, one quick scan of the border. The notches then back to Ray. Something simple, he said. A touch-up. Shouldn't take long. Daniel's shoulders tightened. The muscle under Ray's stencil line jumped once. The smallest betrayal. Ray felt the room change in a way you couldn't explain on paper. The air got thinner. The hum of the machine got louder. The radio preacher's voice warped into static, as if the station itself had flinched. Sure, Ray said. Buying time with politeness. Fill out a form. I'll be right with you. The man didn't move toward the clipboard. He stepped one pace deeper into the shop. Slow, like he owned the distance. I can wait, he said, and his gaze slid to Daniel again. Not curious confirming. Daniel spoke without turning his head. How much longer? Ray picked up the machine again, because doing something with his hands kept panic from showing on his face. Shading and cleanup, he said. 15. Daniel exhaled through his nose, sharp, almost amused, and then he did something Ray hadn't expected. He leaned a fraction toward Ray, voice low enough that the stranger at the door couldn't hear. If you want your shop to stay quiet, Daniel murmured, you'll finish exactly the way the stencil shows. Ray's stomach dropped at the phrasing. Not please, not I paid. Stay quiet. And behind them, the man in the raincoat unfolded his newspaper just enough to show a corner of print, then refolded it. The gesture too neat, too intentional, like a signal rehearsed in a mirror. Ray understood, all at once, why Daniel had chosen a tattoo. Because skin goes anywhere, and once the message was on the body, the handoff wouldn't need a bag, or a meeting, or even a word, just one glance in a crowd, and the right person would know what to do next. Ray kept the needle moving because stopping would announce fear, and fear was the only language a disciplined man at the door might actually understand. The machine's buzz filled the shop like an electrical fence. Ray shaded the wing in tight arcs, following the stencil lines Daniel insisted on, yet his eyes kept sliding to reflections. The raincoat man in the mirror behind the counter, the street lights bleeding through the blinds, the faint movement outside as cars passed and slowed a little too long. The stranger didn't sit. He didn't flip pages. He stood with the newspaper folded in both hands like a prop. His weight distributed evenly, ready to step or bolt without shifting first. When Ray glanced up, the man's eyes were already on him, calm and patient, as if waiting for a kitchen timer to ding. Daniel's voice came again, soft, controlled. No extra lines. I'm not adding anything, Ray said, keeping his own tone neutral. You were about to, Daniel replied, not accusing, stating, like he'd seen it in a training film. Artists like to sign their work. Ray didn't answer. He let the machine speak for him. The ink sank in. The wing darkened. The border sharpened into something that looked less like decoration and more like a lock. The bell above the door didn't ring this time. The door opened anyway, slow, careful, just enough for a thin wedge of cold air to cut across the shop. Someone outside held it for a second, then let it close. No customer entered. The raincoat man's eyes flicked toward the door and back. A microcheck. Daniel's breathing shifted. One shorter inhale. Ray felt the hairs on his arms lift. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was pattern. Ray forced his mind into the only practical lane he had. What can I do that looks normal? He couldn't lunge for the phone. He couldn't lock the door. He couldn't tell Daniel to run, because run to where? Whoever built this moment had already mapped the exits. So Ray chose the smallest rebellion available. He reached for a fresh rinse cup, spilled it accidentally, and muttered a curse. He grabbed paper towels, bent down, and in that moment Half hidden by the counter, he tapped the toe of his boot against the baseboard twice. Hard, like he was shaking off water. The sound traveled through the shared wall into the adjacent unit, Marta's nail salon. Ray didn't know if she was still there after hours. He didn't know if anyone was, but he knew Marta. She stayed late. She liked clean. She hated strange men lingering near her windows. If she heard 2 sharp taps through the wall, she'd come out just to complain. Loudly. A civilian noise. The kind professionals hate. Ray straightened, went back to shading, and watched the raincoat man's jaw tighten a millimeter, as if his patience had been recalculated. Daniel's fingers twitched on the edge of the chair. "You're shaking," Ray said, low, as if talking about pain. "I'm not," Daniel replied. But Ray could see the lie in the muscle near the shoulder blade. The way Daniel's skin kept trying to pull away from the needle, not because it hurt, because time was slipping. The raincoat man finally spoke again, soft as a confession. "You know," he said to Ray, "this city has a lot of talented hands." Ray didn't look up. Lucky city. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Hands that end up doing work they didn't plan on. Ray's heart hit his ribs once, hard, then settled into something colder. He finished the last shading pass and wiped the ink away. The design emerged clean, precise, unforgiving, a family tattoo that felt like an instruction sheet. Ray leaned back and said the only normal sentence that could also be a weapon. "All right," he told Daniel. "Stand up slow. You're going to want to see it in the mirror." Daniel hesitated, then rose carefully. Ray guided him to the mirror by the front windows, putting Daniel between himself and the raincoat man without making it obvious. As Daniel turned to look, the raincoat man folded his newspaper one final time and took a step forward, closer than a walk-in should ever be. And from next door, through the wall, came Marta's voice, sharp, irritated, unmistakably alive. "Ray, why are you banging like that? I'm closing?" The raincoat man froze for half a beat. So did Daniel, and in that half beat, Ray felt the invisible web twitch, just enough to tell him it was real, and just enough to tell him it could be broken. Marta's voice didn't just fill the shop, it changed the geometry of the room, because suddenly there was a third variable no one had planned for, a civilian noise that couldn't be calibrated or predicted. And Ray watched the raincoat man's eyes do the smallest flicker to the left, not toward the door, but toward the shared wall, as if running a mental map of who else might be listening. Marta didn't wait for permission. The nail salon door banged, and a second later she appeared in Ray's doorway, with her coat half on and her purse clutched like a weapon, brows already drawn tight. "You trying to break the building?" she snapped. Then her gaze landed on the stranger, and she slowed. Not fear, not curiosity, just the instinct of someone who can smell trouble the way you smell gas. Ray kept his face bored. "Cup spilled. My bad." Daniel stood at the mirror, shoulders square, but his eyes were on the reflection of the raincoat man, not his tattoo. The man in the suit recovered first. He made his voice friendly, almost amused, the tone of someone who belonged anywhere he stood. "Sorry." "Ma'am, we'll be out in a moment." Marta's stare sharpened. "Who's we?" A half-second pause too clean. The man smiled. "I'm with him." Daniel didn't confirm. He didn't deny. That absence was its own confession. Ray leaned in and touched Daniel's shoulder lightly, as if adjusting his posture for a better look. He felt tension under the skin, coiled. "Ready? You're bleeding a little," Ray said, loud enough for Marta to hear. "You move too fast. You'll smear it. Sit back down for 2 minutes. I'll seal it." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to sit. Sitting meant time. Time meant someone arriving. But he did it anyway. Because the tattoo was now his only reason to be here, and reasons mattered in rooms like this. Ray turned to his counter, moving with practiced calm. He reached for the aftercare tray ointment, plastic wrap, tape, then, without looking obvious, slid his elbow just enough to knock his own metal card case off the edge. It clattered. Marta flinched. The raincoat man's hand dipped toward his pocket on reflex and stopped halfway, catching himself. Ray bent to pick up the case, and as he straightened, he let one business card slip free onto the floor. Face up, where Marta could see it when she stepped closer. The shop name. the address, and on the bottom corner, in Ray's own handwriting from an old joke, a single word he'd written months ago and never bothered to correct. Emergency. Marta's eyes found it. Ray didn't look at her. He didn't nod. He just kept moving. The raincoat man took a step forward. We really do need to go. Ray smiled without warmth. Then don't crowd my station. He dabbed ointment onto the fresh ink and covered it with wrap. Hands steady. And in that tight, antiseptic silence, Daniel's voice came out smaller than before, almost pleading, whether to Ray or to the man behind him wasn't clear. "This is done," he said. "We're done." The raincoat man's gaze drifted past Ray to the front windows, to the street, to the wet reflection of the neon open sign like a pulse in the rain. "Nothing is done," he said quietly. "Not until it's delivered." Ray taped the wrap down with the same care he'd use on any client. But inside his skull, the word delivered rang like a dropped tool in a dark stairwell. Marta shifted her weight, reading the air. "Ray," she said, "slower now. You want me to lock up?" Ray didn't answer her directly. He tore a strip of tape, pressed it down, and said to Daniel, "Aftercare instructions are simple. You forget them. It gets infected." Daniel swallowed, and Ray realized the trap wasn't only outside the shop anymore. It was sitting in his chair. Rain hammered the windows harder, turning the streetlights outside into smeared halos, and Ray felt the whole block tighten the way a city does when something invisible is passing through it. No sirens, no shouting, just an incremental shift in how people move. Marta hovered near the doorway like she was deciding whether to stay and fight or vanish and pretend she'd never seen any of this. And the raincoat man watched her. The way you watch a loose end. You haven't decided to cut yet. Daniel flexed his fingers, testing the wrap on his forearm, and Ray caught the smallest tremor in his wrist. Controlled. But there, a man can sit still through pain. It's fear that makes the body betray itself in micro-movements. You can go, Ray said, wiping his gloves as if this were normal. He kept his voice flat. Practical. You've got your aftercare. Don't touch it. Don't soak it. Don't come back for touch-ups. Daniel didn't move. His eyes slid to the raincoat man, searching for permission like a prisoner waiting for the door to open. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice so Marta couldn't catch every word. "We'll leave together," he said, soft as velvet. "He's coming with me." Ray's stomach sank. Not a ride, not a casual escort. Extraction. Marta's patience snapped into a sharper kind of attention. "Is there a problem?" she asked, too loud. "Because if there's a problem, I'm calling the police." The raincoat man smiled at her, the way a teacher smiles at a child who doesn't understand the lesson yet. "No need. We're just—" Ray cut in, almost gently. "Marta, don't." She stared at him. "Don't what?" "Don't call because you've got some creep in here telling you what to do." Ray didn't look at the man. He looked at Daniel. "If you leave in that storm with him, your tattoo's not the only thing that's going to get ruined." Daniel's throat bobbed. He whispered, barely audible, "I can't stay." Ray heard it the truth inside the lie. Daniel wasn't afraid of Ray. He wasn't afraid of Marta. He was afraid of what happened when he failed to complete a task whose rules he didn't fully control. The raincoat man's tone sharpened, the friendliness thinning. "Enough. Let's go." And then the shop phone rang. One ring. Only one. It wasn't the same sound as before. Higher, like the line had a different impedance, like someone had routed it through something that wasn't supposed to exist in a neighborhood tattoo shop. The ring cut off instantly, but the silence afterward carried an imprint, the way a flash leaves an afterimage behind your eyelids. Daniel went rigid. The raincoat man didn't. He went still in a different way, alert, listening, his eyes tracking upward, toward the ceiling tiles as if the signal hadn't come through the phone at all, but through the building itself. Ray's skin prickled. He understood something without understanding it. That ring wasn't meant for him. It was a prompt, a timing cue. Daniel's gaze snapped to the front window, then to Ray, then to the back of the shop where the narrow hallway led to the alley exit. The raincoat man's hand dipped toward his coat again. Slower this time. Deliberate, Marta whispered. "Ray, what is this?" Ray didn't answer. He didn't have an explanation that fit inside civilian language. Instead, he did the only thing he could do without looking like he knew too much. He stepped between Daniel and the hallway, just half a pace, not blocking like a hero, but crowding the lane the way you do when you're trying to stop someone from walking into traffic. Outside, through the storm blur, a pair of headlights turned into the lot and stopped without parking. And Ray realized the ring had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had brought someone in. The headlights stayed fixed on the storefront like they were pinning the entire room to the wall. And in that hard white wash, Ray saw the raincoat man's hand settle inside his coat with the calm inevitability of someone reaching for a tool he'd used 100 times before. Daniel's breathing turned shallow, the kind of breathing that means a man is already halfway gone. Ray didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He did something uglier and smarter and more human. He made it impossible for the next 10 seconds to be quiet. He snapped the metal stool backward with his heel so it scraped across the concrete floor like a scream. Then slapped the big wall switch that killed the shop's front lights and left only the buzzing neon open sign in the window, a stuttering red-blue pulse that threw their faces into alternating shadows. For one heartbeat, the raincoat man's eyes flicked to the glass, to his own reflection, checking angles, checking witnesses, and that fraction of attention was all Ray needed. Marta finally moved, not toward the phone, not toward the back, toward the front door, yanking it open so the storm air slammed into the shop and the sound of rain poured in loud enough to drown secrets. She yelled into the night, voice breaking, "Help! Somebody!" The raincoat man's hand came out of his coat, but whatever he had wasn't presented like a weapon. It was smaller, meaner, a thing that could vanish back into fabric before anyone could name it. Daniel made a decision that didn't look heroic at all. He bolted not for the alley, not for the street, straight into Ray, shoulder first, like a man trying to knock over the only object between him and drowning. Ray staggered, caught himself on the counter, and in the chaos, the raincoat man's arms snapped forward. A sharp click, too clean to be a gunshot, too sharp to be nothing, followed by a sick, wet hiss as something struck the doorframe where Ray's head had been a second earlier. The wood splintered in a tight little burst. That's when the headlights outside changed, not brighter, but wider, flooding the sidewalk with a new set of beams, and voices cut through the rain in clipped, practiced bursts. "Hands! Now, step back from the door. Don't move." The raincoat man froze mid-motion, a statue caught in the wrong pose. He didn't turn to run. He didn't plead. His eyes simply recalculated fast, cold, searching for the seam in a net that had dropped without warning. A man in a dark jacket moved into the doorway, not rushing, not dramatic, holding his pistol low but ready, rain sheeting off his shoulders. Behind him, another figure angled a flashlight so it blazed across the raincoat man's hands like a spotlight. "Evening," the first man said, almost conversational. "That call you just got. You weren't the only one listening." The raincoat man's mouth tightened, the first real emotion Ray had seen on him all night, irritation, like a machine discovering sand in its gears. Daniel slid down the wall, shaking, staring at his own forearm as if the ink had been the fuse, and he could still see the fire traveling under his skin. Ray stood there with his palms open, heart hammering, watching strangers take control of his shop in the most careful way possible, like they were trying not to break anything that could still talk. One of the men glanced at Ray, just once, and Ray felt the message land without being spoken. "You did the one thing we needed. You made it public." Outside, engines idled, doors opened and closed with soft, deliberate finality, and as the raincoat man was guided out into the storm, he turned his head slightly, just enough for Ray to catch the look he threw back through the glass. Not rage, not fear, recognition, like he'd finally met the invisible hand that had been following his work for a long time. The neon sign kept flickering in the window, washing the room in red and blue, and Ray understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, that his little shop hadn't been a place people came to get art. It had been a place people came to transmit.